This is lecture 8 of the course Haridas Chaudhuri and Integral Yoga, and lecture 2 pertaining to the book Being, Evolution and Immortality by Haridas Chaudhuri. In this lecture, we'll be looking at 5 chapters of the book, chapters titled Idea of the Absolute, Integral View of the Absolute, Change and Permanence, the Meaning of Evolution, and the Goal of Evolution. So, in this book, as we've already seen in the first lecture, Haridas Chaudhuri is presenting the ideas of Sri Aurobindo as a form of Vedanta or a interpretation of the Upanishads that he calls integral non-dualism, and in the Sanskrit Purna Advaita Vedanta. So he's looking at it both from the tradition of Indian philosophy and spiritual philosophy, as well as from the Western tradition. It's a hybrid text and a cross-cultural text in that sense, that is examining contemporary theories of his time, Haridas Chaudhuri's time, which is really the first half of the 20th century, vis-a-vis ideas of the Indian spiritual tradition. So it's a synthesis and a dialogue between a number of philosophical ideas through which the notion of what he calls integral non-dualism is being presented. As we saw with the title of the text, Being, Evolution and Immortality, the first few chapters he deals with the first term of that title, that is with being. And we saw in the last lecture how he looks at different philosophies pertaining to being, again, both Eastern and Western, or Indian and Western, and how he hones in on existentialism as a modern philosophy of his time through which to inspect the notion of an integral non-dualism. We saw this in the last lecture. From this lecture, he continues his investigation of the notion of being and then moves on to the notion of evolution. And he does that by first considering what is the absolute. When we talk about being, this is the ultimate ground of existence, as he calls it. The absolute is the ground of existence. So in the Indian tradition, this is what is given the name Brahman, or rather particularly in the Upanishads. So Upanishadic tradition to which Chaudhuri is bringing Sri Aurobindo's thoughts into alignment, this absolute ground of existence is called Brahman. There is an interesting story with which one of the books that was very influential in the 60s, Satprem's Adventure of Consciousness, introducing the ideas of Sri Aurobindo, begins to introduce the idea of Brahman. The story is about a king who puts forth a challenge to his subjects to tell him who is greater, he or God. And so nobody wants to really come forth to give an answer to this question. But then one wise man makes an attempt. He turns up and the king asks him, who is greater, God or myself? And this person says, undoubtedly you, my lord. And so the king says, what do you think makes me greater than God? He says, because you can exile me from your kingdom, but God cannot. There is no place else to go. So this is in a way a definition of Brahman, a absolute consciousness or an absolute. We cannot even use the word consciousness, something which is absolute. In contemporary times, philosophers like Gilles Deleuze have used the term plane of immanence. He defines the plane of immanence as the plane which is immanent to itself, it's immanent to everything, including itself. And there is nothing which is transcendent to it. So this ultimate ground of all existence is the idea of the absolute, as Chaudhuri introduces it right in the beginning. And that is what he is eventually going to inspect or examine in terms of the notion of being. What is being in Sri Aurobindo's thought? So he starts his investigation by looking at theories of the absolute in our times. What constitutes, or rather in his times, what constitutes the notion of something that explains everything? One idea by which everything may be explained. This is not necessarily monism. Monism is to say that there is one thing, but not one idea by which everything can be spoken of. He first considers pluralism. Pluralism can be a notion of the absolute. And here he looks at thinkers like William James, who talks about reality as the flux of pure experience, or the big, booming, buzzing confusion of the child. So this is the absolute existence, a kind of pure flux of experience, and that whoever or whatever experiences it has to make sense of, has to give it a certain form. And so he points out that there are operations of conjunctions and disjunctions, attractions and repulsions, harmonies and discords, by which we structure a field of sense to make sense or give a certain kind of cosmic idea to this chaos, which is purely pluralistic. This is an idea similar to what philosophers like Gilles Deleuze hold, except that he also holds for a absolute monism at the bottom of this big, booming, buzzing confusion, so to say, or the flux of pure experience. That is the absolute, a kind of substance which cannot be defined, indefinable, which is always in becoming, which seems to be plural. But its plurality, its radical plurality, is a univocity. It is the one that talks through a million voices, as it were. So whether we look at it like that or we look at it as a pluralism that is exclusive, this is the idea of an absolute that is plural. Against this, Chaudhuri considers monism, according to which there is one transcendental or creative principle. And he says that this is something which has a kind of emotional appeal to the human, because we are faced with pluralism all the time, and we are trying to bring it to some kind of a resolution or a sense of containment. It also gives religious satisfaction to us to think about a single God who is sustaining unity of presence. It also gives a certain kind of a comfort to rationality. So, though rationality also views it with doubt as a question mark. So these are the ways by which a monism can actually be an idea of the absolute. These are ideas of the absolute. In case of science, we have the notion of a space-time continuum, and in the case of mysticism, we have the idea of the ocean of consciousness. Now, Chaudhuri is going to go on to talk about other notions of the absolute. So apart from pluralism and monism, are there principles that we can hold up and say, by this everything can be explained? And this has been done throughout history, though he doesn't talk about the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece. They're also trying to do this. For example, different elements are held up to be the absolute. That is the ground of all existence. For Anaximenes, it's air. For Thales, it's water. For Heraclitus, it's fire. For Anaximander, it's the apeiron, which is more like a indefinable infinite that is in between all things. So it's going closer to a more philosophic notion of the absolute that is not limited to one of these elements, that ultimately cannot explain other elements. It's like one element is being made to explain other things that are reduced to it in some sense. Now, instead, he looks at the Taittiriya Upanishad. He does not mention it by name, but as part of his consideration of the absolute, he's going to look at these principles of consciousness which we experience, and in fact, through which we experience. And he talks about the physical as absolute, the vital as absolute, the mental as absolute. So these are all principles of experience. We experience a material world. And so just as science sees that to be a datum that we can all agree about, so we can assume that that is the absolute. That becomes a certain view of the absolute. The Taittiriya Upanishad starts by questioning what is the absolute, and beginning with matter is the absolute. But it doesn't stop there, because clearly in matter new properties emerge which are non-material and to some extent challenge the properties of matter. These are life, the life energy, or rationality, mind, etc. With science, it takes matter to be the datum, the absolute, so that these become epiphenomena of matter. But as most people today feel, as epiphenomena of matter, they are reductionisms. We cannot fully explain the independent primacy of something like the life principle or something like the mind principle. So in the Taittiriya Upanishad, they're going to consider these successively. You have matter as Brahman or as the absolute, the life principle as the absolute, and then again we find that the life principle cannot fully account for our ideational sense in the world. So the mental principle is the absolute, but the mental principle again is not absolute, because we find that there are laws to things, but there is no one law by which everything can be understood. Even when we try to find it, there seems to be something missing. We are trying to actually, we are trying to make everything ideational. We are trying to say life itself can be fully explained by mind, by rationality, which is not true. It doesn't lend itself. There is this principle of freedom in it. So then he moves to the supramental, which is Sri Aurobindo's idea. And in the Taittiriya Upanishad, they give it the name Vijnana. Vijnana, Sri Aurobindo translates it as knowledge. So whereas mana or mental is the rational, a principle of making sense by using logic, the supramental is a pre-existing knowledge. It's already there. It's the ideas that structure reality. And at the same time, if they're immanent, they're not fully expressed. They are vectors of forces of knowledge. So that's the supramental. And he is going to point to the nature of the supermind as multidimensional. Now, we may use other terms for it, but we'll see as we go on how the supramental as an absolute becomes a way of perceiving all these differences that we've mentioned that cannot be reduced to one another as a integrated unity. So multidimensional in that sense that every dimension can actually be seen as part of the one and as the one. So there is a complete integrality principle in this particular plane called the supermind, a supramental, or Vijnana in Sanskrit. Chaudhuri goes forward and talks about spirit or bliss in the Taittiriya Upanishad known as Ananda, and it will say Brahman is Ananda or Anandam Brahma. We could also think about Ananda bliss. It might help to consider what this term means. What is bliss as the absolute, as the foundation of all things? In other terms, in this text itself, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, it is equated with the infinite, Anantam. Anandam is also Anantam. Ananta, infinite, is a qualitative experience of absolute freedom. To be free absolutely without horizon is the experience of the infinite. And that is also qualitatively the experience of absolute bliss. So this is exactly how we find that infinity, and he goes further to call it indeterminate being, must be the absolute. When we compare that with the supramental is a perception consciousness, a way by which the absolute can bring it into a determinate form by viewing it in infinite ways. So it's a filter and a organ of the indeterminate being by which it can determine itself. Now, from this, Chaudhuri moves on to the chapter called the integral view of the absolute. So, integral view of the absolute is related to supermind. As I said, it's a view of the absolute. And he has already introduced this earlier in the text in terms of a verse from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which we discussed in the last lecture, which is the verse related to Purnam or wholeness. It says, Purnam Ada Purnam Idam Purnat Purnam Udachyate Purnasya Purnam Adaya Purnam Eva Vashishyate. This is the whole, that is the whole. Everything that we can point to, that we can call a this, in other words, a self or a subject, and a that or an object is the whole. The whole meaning the infinite whole, the only thing there is, the absolute. So everything is the absolute. Whatever emerges in reality, in appearance as phenomena, is the whole, emerging from the whole. And if we subtract the whole from the whole, it is the whole that remains. So it is a mathematics of infinity or radical infinity that we find. From radical infinity, we can have other orders of infinity that emerge, but radical infinity does not change. And in these other orders of infinity, behind them is radical infinity. It's a self-formulation of radical infinity. To look at reality like this is a kind of a view, and that view is the integral view of the absolute, which Sri Aurobindo is going to call supermind and Taittiriya Upanishad is going to call Vijnana. In looking at this chapter, Haridas Chaudhuri again introduces three forms of experience. And these forms of experience that he calls the natural, the supernatural, and the eternal come to us again from another Upanishad. This is why, even though he doesn't mention these Upanishads in the text, it's important for us to know, because he is engaged in a cross-cultural project. Whatever he's discussing has also a corresponding or parallel conversation that is taking place with the Indian spiritual and philosophical tradition. So these three categories of the natural, the supernatural, and the eternal are being drawn from the Mandukya Upanishad, which is a Upanishad about the mantra Om. And there in that Upanishad, the Om is, the intonation of the Om is given as occupying four conditions of existence known as avasthas. These conditions are the waking condition called Jagrat, the dream condition called swapna, the sleep condition beyond dream that is actually called the sleep within sleep, shushupti, and the fourth, which is just called the fourth, or the unnameable condition called turiya. So here, Chaudhuri is going to look at these in terms of three: natural, which is the waking world; supernatural, which is really what the Mandukya calls the dream world. The dream world is actually the entire world of subjective experience. The world of subjective experience is supernatural because it's also subnatural, but it's supernatural because it opens up to all these determining forces that are behind the laws of the waking universe. So that is the realm of swapna. And then behind that is the indeterminate realm of the eternal, which could be Shushupti and Turiya, one sliding into the other. So here, looking at each of them, Chaudhuri is going to show how each becomes a world to itself that seems to be cut off from the others. When we are awake, we forget the fact that we dream. When we dream, we forget the fact that there's a waking world, though the terms that we experience in each of them are similar. We experience in space and time. We experience entities. So we find that they're linked, but we lose that link. We can remember dreams in our waking, but often we have to attempt or try to draw the thread. And then too, a lot of it we can't remember. Unless a dream is lucid, we don't remember that there is a waking world, and the dream is a kind of continuation with other laws of the waking world. So we find that they tend to become exclusive realities. But if there is a multidimensional being or a omnidimensional being to which all these coexist, one is experiencing all these as one, then that is truly indeterminable and is in its positive sense the creative source of endless determinations. This is how Chaudhuri speaks about it, and to get to that is to enter the Purnam, or the whole, which is the ground of all existence as the absolute. So Chaudhuri is then going to consider the same dualities in terms of subject and object. And he talks about a psycho-cosmic continuum. So by psycho-cosmic continuum, we mean there is cosmos, there is psyche, and the two are inextricably linked. We get something which is a subject-object. And this, again, in certain Indian philosophies like Sankhya, are discussed as two separate things, Purusha and Prakriti. But in other philosophies like the Gita, we see, or in Kashmir Shaivism, we see that there's a way by which they unite into a self-separated two. In other words, it's a paradoxical two-in-one. And that is the zone from which we can look at both of them as independent infinities, and at the same time as the one becoming two, and not losing either its oneness or its two-ness. That is a supramental view. Chaudhuri invokes Karl Jasper's notion of the comprehensive as that type of a consciousness psychocosmic continuum. Again, he looks at this in terms of time. And we find that there are many mystical philosophies that may be called apophatic. An apophatic philosophy is one in which experience is something which is an phenomenal appearance. If we negate it, we arrive at something that cannot be named. This is the notion of the Turiya, as we saw in the fourfold of the Mandukya. If we use Jagrat, Swapna, and Shushupti as what we've discussed so far, the Turiya aspect lends itself to this notion of an apophatic absolute. The absolute is a negative description. After everything that we know in the cosmos is separated out, what remains, the remainder, is the radically infinite. And that is the fourth, or the Turiya, which in this particular case he's talking about as a affirmation followed by a negation. But then he says that in that negation is followed by a greater affirmation. In other words, if we go by that kind of a definition, we'll find that we enter into an infinite recession, that we can get rid of a universe of experience and arrive at a blankness, but that blankness fills up with another universe of experience that has a different quality than what we negated. And then that too can lead to another. So it's a radical infinity, as it were, that goes beyond, and it's only another dimension in which we can experience this, a dimension beyond time, which includes time. So this linearity of affirmations followed by negations can only be resolved in this form in another kind of consciousness, which is the nature of the supermind of Vijnana. So that is the ground of all existence. Finally, Chaudhuri looks at values, and he's talking about a view where, like the Platonic view, where Plato is thinking about the highest ideas as truth, beauty, and goodness, and talking about the ultimate ground as having these supreme ideas. Again, these, as Chaudhuri points out, could be thought of as exclusivities relative to the mind, but must be integral with other conceptions. Otherwise, it becomes a dogma. We also see how these values, they are different ways of looking at supramental unity. If there is a omnidimensional supramental unity, then what we find is that whatever value we put forth, a high value that we put forth, is a derivative of that. Goodness is not a principle that we established by our minds, a quality we established by our minds, but a natural consequence of unity. We cannot but feel towards the other what we feel towards the self, because it is the self. So things of that nature emerge out of a wholeness, and a intrinsic order of the wholeness, intermeshing of the wholeness, arises beauty. So all these qualities are derivative values of a omnidimensional unity of supermind, and they have to be taken in an integral sense. From this chapter, Chaudhuri is going to move to a consideration of change and permanence. This is a continuation of his notion of the absolute, and we can see that whether we think about it in terms of these conditions of waking, sleeping, dreamless sleep, or of the apophatic reality, all these are dualities that are ultimately, I wouldn't say resolved, but integrated in a higher dimensional experience, which is that of Vijnana, or supermind. So too, he hones in on one of these dualities, which is that of eternity and change. He calls it change and permanence. This is a transitional chapter because this is going to lead to his focusing on evolution. And just as there is a way by which spiritual traditions have privileged the one over the many, as we saw pluralism and monism, they have also privileged eternity over change. So we find that from the beginning, the fact that time or impermanence is a painful experience has been asserted. We see this with Buddhism, for example, where the Buddha sees impermanence as the root of suffering. On the other hand, we also have teachers like Heraclitus who see change as the foundation of the absolute, but not as a negative thing. So impermanence can either be seen as a root of suffering or can be seen as something which is positive. But Chaudhuri introduces these two as two forms of experience of impermanence or change. On the other hand, change may be thought of as illusory by those who want to privilege a permanence. Buddhism itself is one of those philosophies. It's going to stand for a apophatic erasure of impermanence. So similarly, we have in Greek philosophy the notion of Zeno with his paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes are very famous, and we see that he makes fun of the fact that to give absolute value to change is paradoxical, because if we actually try to move from point A to point B and think about it in terms of spatial fractioning, in other words, we are moving half the distance and then half the distance, etc., there will always be a remainder. So this paradox allows him to say that that change is really a illusion. You see, we'll come back to this when we look at philosophers who consider change to be real, like in times closer to ours, Henri Bergson. So we find then others who think of change as illusory, like Shankaracharya, the founder of Advaita Vedanta. According to him, change is empirical or phenomenal reality. He calls it Vyavaharika Sattva. It's created by Maya, so it's really a kind of a appearance for us to experience, but not the fundamental reality, not the absolute. So imposition on the absolute. Hegel is another philosopher to whom there is a kind of a truth to history, but the truth to history and change is related to an eternally perfect real and subsumed under logical operations. In other words, everything in a way is already determined by the logical experiments that are being carried out by the time spirit, ideas that are fixed. So he is, we may say when we were talking about mind as the absolute, it's a form of mind as the absolute, that there is a kind of subordination or determination of all of reality based on ideas that are working themselves out through these realities. Then Chaudhuri thinks about phenomenology. And though he doesn't name it as such in this part after considering Hegel, he says that we change constantly, but in surveying the stream of becoming, we rise to a transcendental point of non-change. So it's as if there is a vantage that we can take that allows us to transcend the continuous change that we are experiencing. And here it becomes a question as to whether then the continuous change becomes something that we are superior to, and hence it becomes secondary. We are trying again, like in the case of Buddhism, to overcome impermanence, or whether the changing experiences have any value. Now, Chaudhuri then turns to the reverse, that is, change as real. Unlike impermanence as real, the fundamental absolute is change or movement. And here he considers the strongest proponent of this idea in our times, which is Henri Bergson. According to Bergson, reality is continuous change. And he will say that time is its own reality that we negate because our minds try to take hold of the continuity of our experience and manage it by cutting it up into spatial fragments, like cinematography, in which we have these blocks of moving realities that are put together and made to move. So the mind does that to the continuity of change that we experience. And even to think about that immediately brings Zeno to mind, because exactly that's how Bergson solves Zeno's paradoxes. He says Zeno is subjecting time to space. In other words, what he's doing is that he's already thinking about the continuity of experience in terms of mental frames that are cinematographic and hence that seem to be illusory in terms of reality of time. So Bergson is going to give full value ontological reality to change, and he'll say that to experience it like that, we have to turn back our minds from its rational operation, analytical operation on reality, to contact duration, what he calls duration, which he says is to feel the pulse of reality by intuition. Okay? And he talks about three kinds of change. One is intensive change, extensive change, and evolutionary change. Here we are coming closer to the notion of evolution. Intensive change is happening within us so that it's qualitative. Things have a certain force. Whatever we see outside us as a quantitative reality, like we see an object move from A to B, it has experienced a certain energy that has gone against its inertia to a certain point or a threshold which makes it move. That's the intensive force, intensive movement. Fluid changes as a whole to a new temperature. It takes place as an intensive change within. But once it changes, it may change a state, move from, for example, water to gas or whatever, and we can measure the temperature, or we can measure what the new state is, and the difference between the two, it has become an extensive change. Now, there's also evolutionary change. And in evolutionary change, what is happening is that latent properties that are non-manifest in that substance come into appearance. So it's completely transformed. It's a form of self-transformation. That is an evolutionary change from within, so to say, that there is something that has changed completely. Out of this, Chaudhuri will talk about evolutional philosophy. So this here is change as real. Change, there is a reality to change, and change is not merely just blind change, something without any meaning, but change that seems to have a kind of meaning to it, a meaning of evolution, a meaning of the emergence of new properties. So what is evolution? We'll get to that later, because that's not really the central theme of this particular chapter. But he introduces this notion of evolutional philosophy, and he dwells on this idea of change as real, as being in some sense central to our times, characteristic of our times. He says dynamism is a characteristic of our times. And if you think about it, he draws attention to the fact that everything is in movement. There is a struggle for existence. And of course, we can critique that, because we can see how in our age there is a kind of constant thrust towards doing, towards acting, towards producing, towards progress. So these are really, in a sense, driven by capital to a large extent in our times. And that can be the critique of this thing. Going further back into its more esoteric foundations, we see that there are people who have spoken about this entire movement as coming out of a form of Protestantism in modernity. The rise of Protestantism has brought with it a certain kind of ontological thrust of a kind of a guilt that needs to be overcome through work and through progress. And combine that with the notion of capitalism, and we see that there is a eternal progress in producing more, in enhancing products, in enhancing things, etc., that has forced us into this movement of dynamism. But at the same time, this particular move has other areas, other ideas that it has opened up, which is something like what Bergson is talking about. That though we may say that in a negative sense, all the dynamism of modernity is really backgrounded by either capitalism or Protestant guilt or whatever idea of that kind, it also shows up the notion of change as having a certain kind of ontological reality, an absolute reality that cannot be completely subsumed by eternity, by something that is static and non-changing. Other philosophers have held that view in our times as well. So Chaudhuri will invoke William James, who ridicules a block universe, a universe that is like a block that doesn't change and everything is changing only inside it, as it were. Or Whitehead, who has introduced the idea of process philosophy. The Italian Benedetto Croce, who talks about endless perfectibility. As we saw, Chaudhuri invokes a number of philosophers of his time who have become less important to us today, but who actually, in many cases, were quite significant in his time, but also hold important lessons for us today. So Benedetto Croce, for example, who speaks about the ontological reality of time and change as a thrust for perfectibility, is opening up this door towards evolution. He calls it, so in a way he has Hegelian roots, but he does not subsume all of change to ideas that ultimately are looking towards a finalism, a final telos, like the end of history, etc. He calls it the endless dialectic of the spirit. Other philosophers of change that Chaudhuri will consider are Bosanquet, and we've already come across Samuel Alexander with his notion of emergentism. So from this discussion, Chaudhuri is going to say that both eternalism and temporalism, or eternity and change as philosophies, have their absolute value. They cannot be reduced to one another. They have to be seen as complementary half-truths and inseparable aspects of reality. Again, we have to find a consciousness in which both are integrally one. So he also takes this idea about the two being separate, but both ontologically real, and introduces another kind of view through C.E.M. Joad, another modern philosopher of his time, who talks about the absolute dualism of eternity and change. In other words, here are two worlds. There is a world which is changeless and the world that is constantly changing. Advaita Vedanta can be thought of like that, except Advaita Vedanta will take the second word and subordinate it to the first and call for its erasure. But Jode will say both of them are equal and they are ontologically real with a yawning chasm between them. It's a two-world theory. Now, on the other hand, what Chaudhuri will hold from Sri Aurobindo is that eternity and change are two dimensions of being. And here, again, though he doesn't mention it, he has behind his thinking another Upanishad, which is what makes it a kind of Vedanta, integral Vedanta. This is the Isha Upanishad. And according to that, we have to know both the world of change and the world of eternity together as one, a supramental unity. That which is eternal is exploring itself through degrees of self-consciousness in time. Now, this is a certain idea that Sri Aurobindo is giving us about the relationship between the two. So here we saw that this integral view of the eternal, as it were, is actually connecting the two so that on the one hand, there's something that doesn't change, that includes infinite potentia. And on the other, there is a exploration of that in time that has a certain systematic form to it. The systematic form is the immanence of knowledge that we know as Vijnana. It's not mental, but it's the immanent ideas of the eternal. Eternal as self truths of the self. And these truths of the self have a gradation, a set of degrees of self-consciousness. So we can think about looking at itself, the eternal looking at itself in terms of degrees of consciousness that are graded and that form a certain graduated appearance in time, causing a kind of evolution. Okay, so this is the systemic view of Vijnana. However, this is not like the Hegelian notion of the ideas that are determining emergences in time. Rather, there is a kind of process over here which involves participation. We participate, nature participates in this, as we'll see as we go on. So here, Chaudhuri ends that chapter, which he introduces, called Change and Permanence, and moves into his consideration of evolution proper. So this chapter, next chapter, is called The Meaning of Evolution. So we can ask this question, what is the meaning of evolution? Chaudhuri, I quote from what he says, beside gradual self-development, evolution implies perpetual self-overcoming and self-transcendence. So here is a certain view that there is a kind of a continual overcoming, a transformation, which is an overcoming of the limitations of any particular entity or any particular form that we find. But we can look a little deeper into this whole notion of the meaning of evolution. Evolution in our times comes through Darwin. And according to Darwin, evolution is an evolution of adaptation, of physical forms and how they adapt. So adaptations that are accidental, mutations that are accidental, and that favor survival, that becomes the kind of basis of evolution of adaptable features. So if we see this struggle for survival, as it were, though this is occurring in a way in a form that is accidental and that is automatic, animal species survive, they are favored accidentally, and therefore they are the ones that continue in time. The others die off. But if we look at it from the viewpoint of consciousness, and this opens up the whole notion of evolutional philosophy, that Haridas has introduced in the previous chapter, then we can see it as a kind of drive towards immortality. So we find life enters matter. Matter has a inevitable trend towards breaking down and not supporting life. And life, on the other hand, is trying to maintain itself. And in its attempt to maintain itself, it's looking for immortality. So we find in this survival, ideas of survival, this drive or will towards immortality is at work. We find it actually working at the level of the species. So individuals die, but they leave a certain product which continues in time. And even beyond that, they evolve to greater adaptations that allows them to survive as species even longer. So a consciousness foundation to the understanding of evolution takes us further. We can see that consciousness is something which is behind this will to survive. And when we come to the human, or even in the pre-human, we find that one of the factors that allows survival is not merely physical adaptation, but the adaptations of culture. What are the cultural forms which allow us to survive better? And even after a certain species maybe has become extinct, it survives through the cultural forms that remain. So this is a persistence of consciousness through another kind of product, which today we are looking at as an aspect of continuing evolution, the evolution of culture. Further, we can talk about the persistence of consciousness itself. And here is where we bring it into the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo. We are looking for immortality, and the immortality that we find is an unconscious immortality in the immortality of the species. Or we may find a quasi-conscious immortality in the immortality of culture. But at the same time, we are a consciousness that has a temporal envelope within which we operate. What happened before that, we don't know. We assume there was nothing before that, and we assume there's nothing after that. But this same drive towards survival and towards immortality, if it exists within us, is looking for the ability for consciousness to persist. And that then becomes the basis of foundation of a evolution of consciousness. So if we are talking about the meaning of evolution, we have to see it in terms of survival in that sense. We also have to see it today. There are philosophers who have used the term negentropy. In other words, matter is constantly increasing the entropy of the world. We are finding that there is a breakdown, and in every breakdown, there is a loss of quality, a kind of a irretrievable loss that takes place in energy. On the other hand, if something is trying to utilize those forces of forms and adaptations, morphologies, in such a way that it persists, then it is going against that breakdown. And it's a form of negentropy. Consciousness itself that can stay beyond matter's breakdown and can in fact reverse its relationship with matter to make it persist is expressing material negentropy, and that is possible. So these are ideas that bring us closer in a way to what Sri Aurobindo is saying about evolution. In Sri Aurobindo's view, he is again talking about Vedanta going back to the Upanishads and the Vedas, which talk about a range of forms of consciousness. And there are 7 typal worlds, for example, in the Veda. There is a world of matter, a world of life. This is related to the Taittiriya Upanishad that we talked about. and these absolutes that seem to be irreducible to one another, but emerging from one another. So matter, life, mind, supermind, bliss, consciousness, and being. Here, this entire range of these rungs of consciousness that we may see, Sri Aurobindo sees only one of them as actually evolutionary. He says that these supraphysical planes, the other planes, are actually immanent in matter. They also exist by themselves, but as and in themselves, they allow for a growing self-fulfillment within the limits of fixed types. But in their emergence in matter, material forms are going to hold the consciousness that integrates them and takes them towards the supramental integration that will allow a certain kind of evolutionary form. It's a kind of a transitional evolutionary form from these more unconscious evolutionary forms to a conscious evolutionary form. Evolution doesn't end, it goes on, but there is a kind of qualitative change that takes place in the arrival of supermind or supramental species from a mental species. So this material world as an evolutionary world has all the other worlds involved in it. So this involution of these worlds emerges as an evolution following stages of self-consciousness. And this is the sort of quasi-ideational quality. However, they don't emerge automatically. They're emerging through a certain kind of principle of aspiration. In other words, whatever is locked in matter has hidden within it a certain intuition of what it can become. And this intuition of what it can become, it's not mental at all. It exists right in matter. This is, in a way, carrying out these mutations and also calling on other types that fulfill or meet what its intuition is calling, so as to manifest these rungs that are involved. There is a double process, as we'll see, as Chaudhuri talks about these forms of evolution. So as a result of this kind of process, Chaudhuri will say that this view of evolution reconciles teleology and creative freedom. So there is a teleology, as it were, there is a certain kind of idea, but that idea is not manifesting outside of our participation in it. And creative freedom is driving the way in which that which is behind creation is finding actualization. It's being actualized. So again, talking about this kind of evolution, Chaudhuri introduces two ideas, a progressus ad finitum and a progressus ad infinitum. So progressus ad finitum meaning that there is a finite end to the progress. And progressus ad infinitum is that progress goes infinitely. Evolution has no end. So to discuss these ideas, he invokes several of the philosophers that we've already considered and some new ones. For example, J.M.E. MacTaggart. And we can even go before MacTaggart to Hegel, who talks about the end of history. So the end of history is a progressus ad finitum. MacTaggart also is a proponent of a progressus ad finitum because he talks about a far-off divine event. So that'll be a divinization and there'll be an end to it, as it were. C.E.M. Joad talks about a point of time when there will be the unfettered contemplation of the world of values by humanity as a whole. So in all these views, there's not only an end, there is a end of the entire species. They reach a plateau and they stay on that plateau for good after that. They reach the divine plateau, one may say. Benedetto Croce is talking about something which is more complex. He's saying evolution produces perpetual solutions and perpetually renascent problems demanding a new solution. So that, in a sense, everything that is evolving is a solution to problems, and it gives a certain solution, but at the same time, it is aiming at a greater solution. So this is, in a sense, coming closer to Sri Aurobindo's idea, except that there isn't the notion of the stadia, as it were, which seem to be like stationary plateaus through which there are movements to new plateaus. Chaudhuri does not mention Bergson here, but Bergson has a similar idea with what he calls his memory cone in several of his works, Mind and Matter, for example, or rather Matter and Memory. And over there, what he's talking about is the fact that there are different degrees of compression or concentration of memory, or availability, as it were, of consciousness. And each one of these, in this cone, there are lines which you may talk about as the sections of the cone. Each of them spawns off lines of evolution. So each one of these is a certain type of consciousness that has a certain degree of access to creativity and to survival from that point of view. To be able to, the chances of survival are much greater, going up to a point where he sees the human. Each of these is actually being generated by a force known as the élan vital. We'll see this in a moment when Chaudhuri will talk about the nisus or creative urge of evolution. So I'll hold off Bergson's view till we come to that, but that's what he's talking about as a evolutionary ladder, one may say, that is occurring through participation and through the force of the élan vital that we'll consider in a moment. So Chaudhuri, in talking about Sri Aurobindo's view, says, I quote him, the course of terrestrial evolution is throughout controlled by the idea of a definite goal, the goal of a certain mode of manifestation in terrestrial conditions. So it's as if there is a certain type of consciousness that is present and that in a way is aspiring for a manifestation of its full capacity. And as that is happening, there is also a call to a new rung of the consciousness that starts acting, and the entities of the cosmos start reacting through a certain participation in trying to manifest this in terrestrial conditions. We may, as he says, it's a reconciliation of the idea of determinism and creative participation. And one of the more contemporary philosophers that we may consider uses a term neo-finalism. This is Raymond Rouillère, who also sees in a similar way that there are forces that are, in a sense, present, that are controlling the idea of a goal. That goal is also variable, but the goal is an idea that is being actualized in different ways in the terrestrial conditions. Chaudhuri then considers the notion of nisus, or creative urge of evolution. So what is the force? Is there a force? When we are talking about there is the control by the idea of a definite goal, is there a force inside creation itself? And he brings up another thinker he's considered earlier, that's Samuel Alexander, who has the notion of emergentism. He is saying that new properties emerge from old ones, like matter manifests as an evolution of life, life manifests as an evolution of mind, etc. But he does not see these as involutionary. In other words, life does not exist as part of matter that finds new manifestation from a state of latency. But it's almost as if it comes into matter at a certain point from outside. So emergent properties, but they are not involutionary. Chaudhuri also considers the Indian philosopher Radhakrishnan, who in his interpretation of Alexander says that the nisus of Alexander must be a spiritual power drawing on its resources and ever expressing new forms. So this is how we can see that there can be another interpretation to this type of thought. And he also considers Bergson's élan vital. So élan vital is a explosive force within life. Chaudhuri, which is the creative force of evolution in nature. Chaudhuri critiques it by saying life force must be distinguished from matter, mind, and spirit. But in fact, élan vital is not the life force. Élan vital is carried within the life force. In other words, it's an impulse within life that is responsible for sparking off these different lines of levels of consciousness, one may say, in the memory cone, ultimately coming to a point where the élan vital actualizes itself as a species that can travel up and down the memory cone. In other words, it's not restricted to a line. It can go below and above its specific layer. And this is the human, according to Bergson. So potentially, Bergson is saying the human can actually scramble the planes. This is a phrase used by Deleuze in his book on Bergson called Bergsonism. And in other words, that they can arrive at this omnidimensional consciousness that is not restricted to a single line of manifestation, any exclusive line of manifestation. It's interesting to consider in comparison in its complexity to Sri Aurobindo's view of supermind as a stage in the evolution of nature. Chaudhuri's last chapter for our consideration in this book, Being Evolution, Immortality, is the goal of evolution. Here he talks about three kinds of teleology. One is an unconscious teleology. In other words, there is something which is a final goal that is driving nature unconsciously. Then there's a superconscious teleology, and he introduces Bosanquet as a proponent of that. But the superconscious teleology for him is not a superconsciousness beyond our rational consciousness. It's a superconsciousness beyond the individual consciousness. So for Bosanquet, a superconscious teleology, it can be civilizational or political organization, etc. These are also evolving towards a perfectibility, and that forms a superconscious teleology. But the human belongs to a conscious teleology. And according to Bosanquet, in the human we have an underlying principle of harmony, and he says that teleology is only a sub-form of harmony. In other words, again, as we saw, there is a controlling idea that is driving the conscious evolution, consciousness in evolution, or conscious evolution, which is beyond our mental consciousness. It's a kind of idea of harmony that is underneath it, that we are actualizing, in a sense, in our aspiration for evolving. In Sri Aurobindo's case, there is a superconscient creative energy. Now, finally, we come to the really important point over here, which is what Chaudhuri calls the modus operandi. How does this operate in the human in Sri Aurobindo's case? He talks about two forces, and it's not just in the human, it's happening in a pre-human form in nature, but it starts becoming conscious in the human. Not conscious in the mental, but conscious in the psychic, or conscious as a internal force, a availability of the evolutionary force. And these two operations that he talks about are one, an upward tending force from below, and an upward drawing force from above. So what he's saying is that since the involution of all these planes exists in matter, there is a kind of instinctive aspiration within it to express that which is latent within it. At the same time, because it is deeply, latent, made latent, asleep, it isn't fully conscious of what it needs to manifest. So the upward tending force is an approximate force. It's a force only, not necessarily a knowledge. And the upward drawing force from above is the response of the already existing strata above that particular layer which is aspiring, so that there is a pressure of that of the pressure from below and the response from above both act in creating the possibilities of this particular evolution. See, the pressure of the attractor from above is causing a response to the upward tending force. Now, from here, we may ask the question, how can we access this? How can we be participants in evolution of the kind that Sri Aurobindo is saying? I would say the way towards that is to realize that our mental activity has limits. And whenever we can actually realize that there is something that I want to know, but I am always uncertain about, I am completely at sea about, I'm helpless in front of, we can gather ourselves and aspire. Not aspire to get an answer right away, but aspire towards another form of consciousness which brings us greater clarity and an intuition of what it is that is needed. This aspiration brings about a result, and if we are receptive, then we gradually find that we are being operated on and transformed by a force that is outside us, that we participate in. At the same time, that is us in our higher evolved form. So we are agents of a self-transformation or a self-exceeding, as Nietzsche would have called it. Finally, Chaudhuri considers the human as the limit of evolution, and he says, no, the human is not the limit of evolution, but we are at a stage in evolution. As I said, the mind can never reconcile its own paradoxes and self-discrepancies. To accept the aporetic limits of mental operations brings us to a point where we stand at the threshold of a possible evolution. So the human then becomes a participant in self-evolution. Chaudhuri makes it clear that the human species will not evolve as a block. It's not about all humans will rise to another level, etc. But this is a participant self-transcendence. It must happen in individuals and in small collectives of individuals who commit to such a operation. It's a reaching for that which is beyond and an allowing of its consciousness to act on and in oneself. Thank you.